Very good morning to both of you boys, Unsu and Santosh. Thanks for joining me on this book review. We haven't done one for quite a while now, so really glad to have you guys on board to talk about a book of mine that I really liked. So I actually have this right now, the hard copy in my hands, Civilized to Death, The Price of Progress by Christopher Ryan. So I just first introduced the book a little bit, and I think this is one of those occasions where all of us have read the book at least a little bit to some degree, so we can talk about our feelings about the book. So first thing I want to say, right, is that this book to me is like the textbook for our channel, because this book is about breaking myths, breaking spells, and what bigger spell can there be? Bigger spell can there be but civilization, right? Like literally, like the way that we are organized as a modern society. And Christopher Ryan, just to be very clear, I mean, I have a certain bias towards him, so I just want to put that out there because I just think that he's such a fascinating person, and I have to really say that as someone who lives a very unorthodox lifestyle. So Christopher Ryan is an anthropologist, and he has been known to live outside a van and travel around the world. He has many different types of jobs in his lifetime. He has taught English to Thailand prostitutes in Bangkok. He has gutted salmon in Alaska, taught self-defense in Mexico. So, such a colorful character. And I'm just of the opinion that if an author actualizes and lives out the values that he writes about, I mean, that's a very interesting and worthwhile character to pay attention to. So anyway, before I get to talking about Civilized to Death, right, the other thing about Chris Ryan, just to put it in perspective, is that he had a previous bestseller book called Sex at Dawn. And that book was about challenging very conventional ideas about sexuality, monogamy, marriage, and family. So in this book, right, Civilized to Death, he basically broadens his scope, right, to looking at progress, essentially. So, now he looks at the way that we eat, the way that we learn, we move, we communicate, work, and die even, right? And the basic point is this, which is we like to think that as the way that we live right now, right? We like to imagine that we've reached the pinnacle of, human history, of progress and civilization. We're so lucky to be living this era. And there are many, popular writers like Steven Pinker, Matt Ridley, that spread that kind of message. And these authors have best-selling books out there, right? Like Better Angels of Our Human Nature, Enlightenment Now, books like that try to tell us, hey, be grateful. Life in the past used to be, as in the words of Thomas Hobbes, the philosopher, nasty, brutish, and short. So, we're pretty darn lucky to be living where we are right now. And I also think that, just colloquially, like the way that we, especially we living in Singapore as a, very developed first world nation, we look at developing countries and we kind of make that implicit assumption that, they are in an inferior state compared to us, right? They don't have the best iPhones, the latest phones, the fastest internet, or they don't have fancy restaurants, or maybe even the idea that they don't have so many rich people. So we assume that they're not so smart or hardworking and progressive as us. Yeah. So here's the thing, right? Chris Ryan does not deny that there are aspects of our technological progress that has been beneficial. So vaccination is one of them, obviously. Private transport, air transport, medical technology, being able to, podcast right now with the phones that we have. So this is all undeniable. He's not putting all that away. But what he wants us to also reflect on is that a lot of aspects of our civilization. So let's take current infectious diseases like influenza, chickenpox, malaria. I mean, this also came about because of the way that we've domesticated animals through civilization. Also look at the idea that, yes, we can fly, so that helps to bring people across different countries. But at the same time, we can throw bombs, and we can hunt. We hunt now, like say, fishes in great masses. So yes, it brings a lot of food to our population, but at the same time, we are also destroying the environment. So Chris basically imagines, right, like if you bring a hunter-gatherer to from the prehistoric past to our civilization right now, what would he think? And actually, that question doesn't seem so hypothetical because there actually have been records of indigenous people, people from tribal societies, who were invited to join our civilization. But many times, and he documents this in the book, they actually, are not interested, and they get actually in the words of Benjamin Franklin, they can become disgusted with our manner of life and the care, the pains that are necessary to support it, and take the first good opportunity of escaping again into the woods. And Chris Wright also talks about how even among us, right, even as we try to integrate ourselves into this new world with tech and capitalism, but you can find many members, people around us who still try to retreat back or try to capture as much of ancient traditions or going paleo, of things that they want to, the things that they feel that are very relevant, that's important for us in a healthy sense, but we don't have in modern society. So just a few notes to say that in the book, right, interpersonal throughout the book, he quotes from many famous people like Charles Darwin, Carl Jung, Stephen Jay Gould, a evolutionary biologist, Jared Diamond, and all these authors, right, and prominent scholars, they have a very consistent message that they do see civilization as potentially noxious, as non-operational, an idea that's really is a big mistake. Jared Diamond is said that when we look at civilization, we make the false assumption that civilization is good, that tribal hunter-gatherers are miserable, and he also doesn't assume that just because we live in an industrialized state, it means that we are better than hunter-gatherers, right? That we shouldn't make that kind of assumption. So to finish off the introduction, right, Chris writes, right, when you're going the wrong direction, progress is the last thing that we need. And the question that we have to confront today is, are we going in the right direction? We shouldn't just forget that there have been civilizations before us that have collapsed, right? We are not necessarily going to be the most unique in that factor as well. And he also cites this historian, Ronald Wright, who says that each time, right, as we progress up this repeat of history, right, the price goes up, and we are now going to pay the most exorbitant price ever, which is potentially the brink of human extinction. So how do we combat this? How do we address this? And I like what Chris Ryan wrote, which is, it's because we don't understand our species. We need to understand our species. And the way that we can do that is going back to prehistoric past and trying to figure out what we were like. So anyway, the book you, I assume, have read some bits of the book, or at least got acquainted with the ideas. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, right, which is for later on, just want to ask you guys, what's your reactions? What's your sense of even, trying to deliberate on the idea of progress? Yeah.
Yeah, no, I haven't read most of the book actually. I've just read the first part and then jumped to the end, read his conclusion, and a few of the last chapters. But I generally agree with his argument that there's a huge price that we've paid for progress, and like he refers to Ronald Wright quite a bit. And I've actually listened to Ronald Wright's lectures. So the book that he wrote, A Short History on Progress, is based on this 5-part series of lectures that he gave as part of the Canadian, Broadcasting Corporation lecture series. And it's really it's a wonderful lecture series. I highly recommend people look it up. It's available for free on the CBC website. And he goes through stories of how so many civilizations in the past have just collapsed. One of the most striking examples is the one of Rome. Rome persisted for over 1,000 years, and then you would never think towards the end that it would just collapse, right? And I feel that's the situation we are in right now. Like 1 minute, Rome had the Colosseum, gladiators, roads, everything. Within 50 to 100 years, no roads, nothing. They went into the dark ages, and I really feel that we are at that precipice right now. And unlike other civilizations, where we now have a global civilization, there's nowhere else to run. When other civilizations collapsed, there were other parts of the world that we hadn't destroyed yet. That is not the case today. And so, I from what I've read of the book so far, I enjoyed it a lot. I liked all his different references. I liked his language. It was very entertaining. I mean, there's a lot of witty, expressions in there. So that's my brief impression so far?
Yeah, for me, I feel there's this analogy of the boiling frog. So if you put a frog in boiling hot water, it would jump out immediately. But if you put it in just cold water and you amp up the temperature bit by bit, the frog will be boiled alive and the frog wouldn't even realize it. And like what Unsu mentioned, right? I think we're on the brink of the collapse of this civilization. It's imminent, but we're not even aware because we are the knob of the heat is just turning up bit by bit, and we're not aware of it. So that's the first thing that came to my mind as Ansu mentioned about the brink of a collapse of this civilization. The second thing that that came to my mind was we shouldn't be throwing the baby out of the bathwater. So as Douglas, you rightfully mentioned, he did say that we don't want to throw our kettles, our electricity, our like hot showers and all of that, like fans and yeah. So these are the good aspects of civilization, but I think there is a significant part of rewilding and uncivilizing that I am prepared to do because I've personally experienced the benefits of it. So my take on this is the proof is in the pudding, and I've experienced it myself when I rewild myself and when I get back in touch with nature. It is just amazing. The healing effects are palpable. We can experience it, and I'm completely aligned to his ideas. And the third thing is about measures of progress. If there is something that I would like to bring out in the conversations about the one sole indicator of progress that we have held ourselves accountable to, which is GDP, gross domestic product. And this follows the linear growth accounting model. Yeah, and if you look at the cycles of nature are completely incoherent and out of resonance with that linear model of growth accounting. And I think that is, yeah, if we want to rethink progress, we need to rethink the measures of progress. And there are alternatives, mind you, there are alternatives that place well-being of our citizens and our societies front and center in terms of how we define and how we measure success and happiness as a civilization. Yeah, so these are readily available and we can talk about them as well. Yeah, so those are 3 points that came to my mind.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for all that, man. Yeah, I really appreciate that the two of you chime in with what you like about the messaging and the content of the book, even if you haven't finished it. Two things I just want to add. So that is, like I think when I proposed this book, I imagine the two of you wouldn't have known who Chris Ryan was. And this is the thing about why I want to, have this book on the show, because I think Chris Ryan is just one of those renegade academics out there, right? Like I just described his life a little bit, and he's really, really, like I said, very colorful, and I like that, right? Like I think that this is someone that's very broad perspective, is able to see nuances, and also at the same time, he's just not as well known. I can imagine that this message that he has will be very appealing and very attractive to many people out there who are very disgruntled and unhappy with the way we lead our lives right now. And there's so much takeaway that you can get from understanding the civilized to death thesis. So that's one. And then two, yeah, I think that is something that you brought up, Santosh, which is regarding the idea that yes, we're not trying to throw everything out in civilization. So a good metaphor, which I meant to reserve it for the conclusion, but I'll just say it right now, which is Chris Ryan uses the idea of a zoo, right? So what has actually happened is that we live in a zoo. It's clearly one that we created and constructed. But the question is, what kind of zoo do we want it to be? And he uses the example of a very poor, dilapidated zoo that he saw in a foreign country, and a zoo that he saw, say, in America. And of course, a really good one, not a bad one. And this is the metaphor that he likes us to put in our minds, right? Which is, if we're going to live in a zoo, what kind of zoo should we sculpt it to be like? And that's what we can talk about at the end of our conversation. And yeah, also, he's a witty guy. I love that he's very blunt. This is a guy that would throw out the F word, and that's an appeal to me as well. Yeah, just someone who's just he's not tactless. He's just being blunt, and I like that. I admire that. Okay, shall I just move on, or do you guys have anything else you want to add on?
Sure. Yeah. Move on.
Okay, cool. So, the very first part of the book, obviously, we have to talk about, which is to talk about, what we're talking about in terms of the origin of our species, right? Because we're going to try to understand our species, what is our origin. So, his beginning sentence is something like this, right? Which is, we may not know each other. So, meaning that there are many, many people out there in the world that we won't know individually, but we can sort of know each other as a species pretty well, because there are going to be a lot of similarities despite our differences, because we evolved from Africa 300,000 years ago. And like I said, he's an anthropologist, and we had an anthropologist professor just last week, right? And in true anthropological research, you can find out a lot of similarities. So one of the things that they do is they look into hunter-gatherer lifestyles, or foraging as an activity, which is many thousands of years ago. And through that, right, you can find out certain things about the body, anatomically, physiologically, and how our body is shaped by the evolutionary process. One example that he uses, which I really like, because me being a health practitioner, is the use of our modern toilets. Right, we sit on our modern toilets, but actually the best way to do our number two is to squat. Yeah, and this is what a lot of people actually do in less developed places, and that's the thing, which is if you look at something as simple as that, you come to realize that our body is built in a certain way to do things well or very optimally, right? And the problem with what we do in civilization, or with our way of civilizing our way of life, is that sometimes we are getting further away from what's actually optimal for us. So a good framework he uses is capacities versus tendencies. So capacities is something that he considers immutable, so it can't be changed. And tendencies can be something that you can ignore, you can overcome. So a good example, we are not born natural swimmers, right? But we can overcome the fear of the ocean and learn to swim, but we can never breathe underwater because we're just not born with gills. Diet, we can be vegetarians for sure, but we're not by nature herbivores. And when you look at examples like that, you can see that the human species is really interesting. It's very different from other animals. There is a very broad range of stuff that we can do. But at the same time, just like being an animal, there are some things that are just not very good for us. So one example is also loneliness, because we are such a pro-social species that, if we were put in solitary confinement, it's one of the worst punishments you can give to a human being. And so going back to Chris Ryan's very witty language, quoting one here, he says, we can spend our waking lives sitting in cubicles, working thankless jobs under fluorescent lighting, but we shouldn't be surprised by the depression, anxiety, addictive behavior, and sudden explosions of violence such conditions often provoke. Many of us are clearly capable of inflicting great pain on others, especially those of us who suffered abuse at a young age, but nobody suffers from PTSD because they help a stranger. So just, take that in mind. So going back to the idea about foragers or hunter-gatherer societies, right? So here's an interesting thing, which is obviously human beings that live in all sorts of places, so that's great ecological variation, right? You can live in the Amazon to the Arctic to the Australian outback, but there is three universal qualities that have been found, and these universal attributes kind of define how hunter-gatherer societies have kind of managed conflict and learn to thrive in such harsh environments. So the first one is fierce egalitarianism. So the idea here is that the individual's autonomy is non-negotiable, and there is some leadership, but the leadership is not imposed, and it's very informal and non-coercive. It's actually like due to consensus and respect. So the person who's a leader just happens to have a better informed opinion, but he does not try to seize power on his own. And interestingly enough, in this societies, they also try to ensure that various mechanisms in place that there is not one person trying to wrestle his way to the top. Yeah, and even for children, they are actually respected as autonomous individuals, and they can be also cared for by unbiologically related adults as well as their biological parents. The second universal attribute is mobility. So obviously back then they didn't live in cities with millions of people living together. They kind of gathered in small bands, and the idea is that because they're such small groups, they actually move around a lot. And this movement is not just going from one harsh environment to another, but also they can split up, they can change members, and they do all this because sometimes they want to either avoid conflict or maybe have change of functions. Yeah. Then the third one is actually gratitude. Okay, so gratitude, right, is the idea that these foragers, right, they tend to look at themselves as very fortunate recipients of a generous and benevolent environment, or sometimes they look at it as a spirit world. They look at the land as a source of all they need. And this is very contrary to what I mentioned just now, which is they're very modern thinkers who consider that the natural world is very hostile, it's very dangerous. There's all sorts of things you need to be careful about because someone's going to eat you or you're going to get hurt or injured. But these foragers don't look at it that way. And I like this example from the book. So it comes from an anthropologist called Daniel Everett, and he was researching on the Pitiha foragers in Upper Amazon, and he describes them as people who would laugh about everything. So even when they don't catch something, they laugh. If they catch a lot of fish, they laugh. If the house the hut gets blown over, they laugh. But if they build a very nice hut, they also laugh. So this is very easy harmony that they have with the environment. So to sum up, right, basically the way that Chris Wright describes it is that we seem to operate best as egalitarians, as being mobile. There's very little, there's obligatory sharing of minimal property. There's open access to the necessities of life. So, water, food, shelter. And there's a sense of gratitude, right, to what was provided, than more that you need. Now, here's the important thing, which is this conclusion that I just spelled out. It's actually not controversial. It's actually quite high consensus among scholars. Yeah, and the interesting thing also is that even though there have been exceptions, because sometimes people, try to nitpick at the data, say that, there have been, say, child abuse or women have been treated poorly in certain societies, which is not true, not untrue. These things do happen. But the important takeaway is that, our ancestors lived for millions of years like this in all sorts of different environments. And they have very, good takeaways about how we can try to distribute power, wealth, care for the young, and resolve conflict. So that sums up the first part of the argument of the thesis. So what I want to ask the both of you is, because I know you guys are, great knowledgeable bearers of indigenous wisdom. Does this reconcile with what you know? And the other question I have for you guys is how you look at the three things that I mentioned, right? Egalitarianism, mobility, and gratitude, and sort of rank that and measure that with the way that we live right now.
Santosh, you go first.
I feel this is completely aligned to ancient and indigenous wisdom. If there's something that came to my mind, it was just the previous lecture series that I've been watching of Dr. Gabor Mate, who is an expert on trauma. And Dr. Gabor Mate says that safety is not the absence of threat. Safety is the presence of connection. At the heart of, I think, Christopher Ryan's message, right, is that it's about human-to-human connection. And we've lost human-to-human connection. And we've replaced the void of not having human-to-human connection with connection to other things, devices, and many other things that has resulted in the ills of this modern civilization. And so for me, the key to unlocking healing in our civilization is going back to human connection. And that means, very simply, community connection. So when I get out of my house is to look at my neighbor in the eye and just to smile and just to, just meet people where they are and just connect as human beings. So that is, for me, a very profound shift that is very easy to undertake, that can enact a major shift in our consciousness and thus the trajectory of this civilization. So this is, for me, like the crux of his message, which is to bring back connection, human-to-human connection. And I think connection is the foundational block that actually holds egalitarianism, gratitude, and mobility. Yeah, you need that connection, and people need to be connected with not only other skin-encapsulated bodies, but also Mother Nature. When we realize underneath this need for connection that we're not skin encapsulated bodies and we're not separate from one another and from Mother Nature, that's where the three pillars that you talked about, which are egalitarianism, mobility, and gratitude, can be fulfilled. With regards to ranking, I feel like mobility is something that we have control over, but egalitarianism, mobility and gratitude are two things that we have control over. So we can practice gratitude. And in the ancient and spiritual wisdom, gratitude and contentment are like major key practices of all ancient traditions or ancient faith traditions. So gratitude is something that is easily accessible. So is mobility. While we can go to a workplace, we can find means and ways to introduce mobility into our sedentary lifestyles. So that is also accessible. But what is, I think, not so accessible is egalitarianism. And what we have in our society is a structure that is very hierarchical and pyramidal, where power is concentrated in a few in a centralized manner, whereas what the indigenous and ancient wisdom says is that power needs to be in a distributed manner. So if you look at network theory, our modern civilization has power in a concentrated manner, so it's centralized and we're not even talking about decentralized power. We're talking about distributed power. If you look at network topologies, that is the ideal state. So if there is a lever I would like to pull in this civilization, it's really the spirit of egalitarianism. Now, to move forward in the spirit of egalitarianism, Unsu is a great facilitator of sociocracy. So Unsu can share a bit more about sociocracy, which is a method to help bring about more egalitarianism in teams and groups and organizations. It's a decision-making protocol where we seek opinions and views from every other member, and we ask them for their true assessment of whether they consent or they don't consent. So I think there is a way to push this lever, this final lever of egalitarianism, and there are practices that we can imbibe in a setting like this, or in the family, or in schools, or in the workplace, that is based on sociocratic principles. So such principles are readily available. That's my reaction to what you mentioned, Douglas. Yeah.
Yeah, just to respond to what you were saying about connection, I agree connection is important, but also the right kinds of connections. Like, so what strikes me about these three qualities that he identifies, egalitarianism, gratitude, mobility, is that it's a fluid kind of connection. Because you could have rigid connections, like you could have the molecules of a diamond that are connected to each other in a very rigid way, where it's not fluid. And what we want is connections that are fluid. And I actually disagree with Santosh that it's easy for us to practice mobility as individuals. I actually don't think it's that easy. I mean, so one aspect of mobility is not just physical; it's the ability to leave a group and join another group. That's what he observed with like hunter-gatherer tribes, right? Like, if you want to change a scene, you could leave your tribe and join another tribe without much consequences. I actually believe that we live in a world where we have very strong in-group, out-group sentiments. Sort of like you're either with us or against us. And even like in a corporate structure, right? Like if you work for Apple, you're not allowed to own an Android phone. Like if you were caught owning an Android phone, like you'd be out of it, So I think that goes against kind of this principle of mobility, that you want to be free to, exchange an environment, influences. I actually love the fact that he distilled everything down to these three qualities. It makes it more manageable. Like, I always dislike it when people give me a list of like 10 different things. I can't keep it all in my mind. And they, as he points out, they map to three different spheres of human experience. So egalitarianism is the social sphere, mobility is the physical sphere, and gratitude is the psychological sphere. So that covers like all the important areas that we need for human thriving. And what these three qualities contribute, which I believe we have lost, is a certain experience of flow. I think hunter-gatherers lived in a state of flow with each other, with nature. And so if I were to measure or benchmark our current civilization against these three qualities, I'd say we failed miserably.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I also have some reactions to what you guys mentioned. So let's go to the mobility one, because that's very good that you brought it up, Unsu, about how mobility as the way we conceive it is also quite limited, right? You mentioned the idea that if you work in Apple, you can't own even a rival company phone. But also even thinking broadly, when you leave a company, or let's say you leave a job and you want to go to a different job, it's not very easy as well, because now you're required to show that you got the experience, and that reminds me of a funny meme, but it's supposed to be quite real, which is like an advertisement for like a job, and then they say looking for new recruits with 6-7 years experience. It's that kind of nonsense that's going around the world, where it's like it's very hard to move around. And also thinking in the physical sense, right? Like we live in Singapore, so it's a very small place. There's really not a lot of mobility that you can do. I'm not even talking about working, but let's say you want to live a different lifestyle. So unlike if you live in, say, America or some other very huge country, where you have a chance to actually say, okay, I'll go to another state, I will downgrade to living in a more idyllic, simplistic kind of manner. But we can't do that here in Singapore. It's very hard, right? So that's one thing about mobility that I feel it's a very important dimension, but we need to talk about it a little bit more beyond what is conventionally known as social mobility. So that's one. In terms of the
Sorry,
gratitude,
I also wanted to add that it wasn't just social mobility that I think he's right on. I think it's also physical mobility, because right now we are doing a Zoom call and we are fixed in our chairs. I have to stare at the screen. I mean, compare that to a hunter-gatherer. Like, they wouldn't be sitting in one spot, staring at one spot for 1 hour. So this is what our civilization has done to us, and we accept it. We accept that this immobility is normal. So anyway, yeah, just wanted to add that it's also physical mobility that I think we are restricted. Like, we're not free to move and behave as we would otherwise.
So the next
Yeah, no.
episode will be a BTS episode, which will be a walk in the park, and we'll be recording ourselves talking while we're walking in the park.
Actually, I was going to add on, like, please promote mobility of speech. So feel free to jump in. Yeah, it helps also, with the way that we converse with each other. Yeah, so no, yeah, you're right, Ongsu. I mean, we are also very physically constrained right now, right? And of course, this is a unique situation. It's COVID, the pandemic, and all that. But yeah, we could benefit a lot from just being able to move around and spend time with each other. Then I think the one on gratitude is also one worth commenting on, which is I think you guys know me well enough that I don't like things that are spoken in a very spiritual, abstract kind of manner. So, am I grateful for where we are right now in life or for the environment? Yeah, I am. But I like to see that institutionalized, right? So to me, a good example is the way that we see in very progressive places, right, in other countries in particular, they start to pay gratitude or tribute, sorry, to the land, and that the land is owned by a indigenous tribe or society, right? And that's at least one starting point. It's definitely not the be all and all of showing gratitude, but you got to start from there. You got to start acknowledging that the land has a certain kind of right or ownership in our lives. And actually, I don't even like the word ownership, because we're going to talk about that later. But the idea is that it has a certain place and entitlement, right? It has a certain right to live kind of unperturbed and definitely not destroyed by industrial civilization. So we need to have protocols and measures like that. And then on the fierce egalitarianism, I mean, what's there really to say? Both of you have obviously outlined how extremely un-egalitarian that we are. But I guess we will talk about that a little bit more later when I talk about inequality and all that, because fundamentally at the end of the day, to establish an egalitarian society, you do need to have strong measures in place. We can observe that from obviously the tribal societies as to what they do, because it's so small. It's quite easy to just use social norms. But once you upscale that to millions of people, and now we live in a political environment where we implicitly assume that one person has to be the leader, this one person has the answers to everything in life, to all the problems in society. I think we have to debunk such assumptions as well, if we want to have a more egalitarian society.
Yeah,
Um,
something that came to
yeah,
my
go ahead.
mind, I was taking a walk in Dover Forest. So to all our viewers, please go to Dover Forest in Singapore. There's the east part and the west part. It's beautiful, it's amazing. And I was led by a tour guide who actually lived very close to Dover Forest. And he treats Dover Forest as his land. And he advocates for Dover Forest. He goes to ministerial meetings, citizen consultation meetings to talk about the Dover Forest clearing. He gives his views. He speaks on behalf of the land that he is a part of. That was so beautiful for me to experience. And one thing that came to my mind as we were walking and we were saying that is going to be cleared, this part is going to be preserved. And then he said, right, but the trees and the plants, they don't have a voice. They can't channel their voice into parliament to be heard. Only human voices can be heard in parliament. So what about voice of the land and nature? Yeah, and I feel like we've conditioned ourselves to view communication in very human verbal forms, and we failed to attune to the language of the land. And the land speaks to us in very subtle ways. And a very important manifestation of this is the principle and the entire philosophy of Ayurveda, which is a traditional Indian medicine system. So what the ancient seers they did is they meditated in the midst of the forest, and they went to plants and they communicated. They were in communion with the plants, and the plants revealed their secrets and their properties to them. And that requires an intentional effort on the part of human beings to reconnect with their land. Yeah, so that was very fascinating for me to experience in Dover Forest. Yeah.
Thanks. Actually, let me stay on that a little bit because yeah, this is actually a good time to bring this up. So Singapore is one of those places that is quite paradoxical. You can see actually Singapore being advertised as a green city, right? So especially when you look at, say, an advertisement from the World Economic Forum, they tend to put a lot of they highlight a lot of footage from the Marina Bay, the Marina Bay Gardens, yeah. And you know, I've seen documentaries where Singapore is used as a paradigmic example of a city in the future where there's integration of nature and urban settings. The authors that we have, you know, running around Singapore rivers, that's sometimes used as an example where wildlife has kind of like been revived, you know. And like I said, it's very paradoxical because you mentioned about the clearing of the Dover forest. And I actually remembered, I don't have the data right now, but it's just a couple of months back, there was some kind of survey that was done on a national level, and Singaporeans overwhelmingly wanted greener spaces. They wanted, if I'm not wrong, definitely less industrialization or less building of condos and stuff like that. Well, then again, I could be wrong about that part, but the general takeaway message was that it astonished me because, you know, Singapore, like I said, is not that kind of place where, well, Singaporeans is not the kind of people that you think are green hippies, okay? So to see that there was such a huge, like, I'm thinking like 70-80% of people being polled said that they would really want to see a more green Singapore, more sustainable Singapore. I mean, that speaks to me about what's underlying, you know, like human nature. I think as much as we like living in the city, I'm talking about generic right? Like people living in Singapore, for example. But there is something that harkens us back to wanting to integrate with nature or to see more of nature. And I think we have that struggle right now. Yeah. Okay. Unsu, if you don't have anything to add, I'll move on.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the next part of our conversation, right, which I prepared is really, now that we've talked a little bit about what we can learn from hunter-gatherers, then, you know, what happened to us? You know, why are we not living like that, right? If this sounds so idyllic and beautiful, why haven't we progressed to living in a more hunter-gatherer type of society? So I'm going to start with some statistics. Okay, these are American statistics that I got from the book, but you can imagine there are probably Singaporean or Asian parallels. So 1/3 of American children are overweight or obese. 54 million of Americans are pre-diabetic. Preschoolers have become reliant on antidepressants. Rate of depression is going up among the young. 24 million Americans are thought to suffer from PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, not because of war, but because of never-ending class war, right? So we also produce more food than ever, but nutritional content is poor. And, you know, for those of us who are really lucky and privileged to live in civilized societies, but hunger and malnutrition are still running rampant in other parts of the world. And more importantly, this famine and obesity was not actually so common, right, until the advent of civilization. So what accounts for all this? Why did all this happen? So what Chris Ryan did was that he essentially showed that many of the authors that you know of right now, they're very popular, like Jared Diamond, Yuval Noah Harari. So this anthropologists and historians, there is a consensus among them, and that is the industrialization of agriculture. It's being commented as history's biggest fraud. It's also been argued that what agriculturalism has done to us is that even though we have bigger plates, right, we have bigger food, we have more access to food, but it didn't translate to a better diet. We work harder and longer than hunter-gatherers in order to attain this food. Obviously, drastic increase in social inequality, violence in the sense of organized conflict, and elites basically appointing themselves, using religion, which is something that Chris Ryan also talks about, to obtain power. So we're going to talk about concepts here. Okay, so the whole idea about agriculturalism is that it's about ownership. So when we compare hunter-gatherer societies, right, like ownership is, like I said, very minimal, right, because everything was shared. I can talk about that later with a vivid example. But the idea is that due to agriculturalism, now ownership has become the new spirit of the day, right? So not only can men, and I mean men literally like biological men, can own land and food and seeds and water and animals, but eventually he can own other human beings, right? And women who used to be respected members of an egalitarian society, they also became reduced to a status that's close to domesticated animals. Chris Ryan has this takeaway from the Bible. He says, if you look at the passage Exodus 20:17, where it says, "Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife," we take that to assume that it means that, okay, don't steal your neighbor's wife, like as if it's about infidelity. But if you read the whole passage, it actually takes a very different tone. It's actually, "Thou shalt not covet thou neighbor's house, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that's thy neighbor's." So it's not just about the wife, it's about everything that belongs to the neighbor, his properties, and that includes the wife. Yeah. So anyway, so as we move along, and obviously there's a huge rich history behind this, and I can't go through all of that, but this idea that nomadism, right, the idea that we will move around small bands and communities got displaced, because now we live in big cities, we start to own a lot of property, and as I mentioned earlier, we live in now this zoo, right? And he actually thinks that the zoo that we live in isn't very far off from the industrialized farming places that we've installed, like living in overcrowded places, being herded about without explanation, being whipped into compliance and sold and slaughtered. Yeah. And so that's the other important component besides ownership, which is hierarchy and specialized labor. So now, people would fit themselves into a certain role. So you got priests, you got rulers, you got guards, you got soldiers, and all of them have a certain role to play in protecting property and accumulating wealth. And hence that led to the next thing, which is imperialism and colonialism. So I'm going to read one passage from the book because I think this is quite heart-wrenching to read. So it actually deals with Christopher Columbus, and that is when he first met the native people in the West Indies. He wrote in a letter, "They are very simple and honest and exceedingly liberal with all they have, none of them refusing anything he may possess when he's asked for it. They exhibit great love towards all others in preference to themselves." He continues, "They are the best people in the world, and above all, the gentlest without knowledge of what is evil, nor do they murder or steal. They love their neighbors as themselves, and they have the sweetest talk in the world, always laughing." And a few pages after that, Columbus wrote, "They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." And this is a very sad aspect of civilization, of this process of civilization, which is the people who think of themselves as being civilized look at the non-civilized as less than human, and employ the idea that power makes right. And so whether Chris Ryan talks about how whether you look at this in China, Africa, India, Europe, it doesn't change. There's this very recurrent pattern in human history where we have this group of people who always assume they're better than the so-called savages. And when they go there to rape and pilgrimage, this natives people, they have to do so much violence in order to co-opt them, right? And one of the things that Chris Ryan says is that, if you had a truly superior social system, you don't have to forcibly recruit new members. Yeah. So anyway, moving on a little bit, right? The idea is that if you look at this, right, then one thing becomes very clear, which is the third idea, which is you need cheap labor, because with cheap labor, then that's the way that you can have workers to plant and harvest crops, armies to conquer, whole new land, slaves to dig canals and build roads. And men had to be made poor, so poor that have to be forced to join his other men in the mines, the armies, and the factories. And so there's this other quote here, and I think it's really going to, kind of crystallize what's so wrong, right, with all this, which is about poverty. And it comes from a London police magistrate. And so the quote reads, "Poverty is a most necessary and indispensable ingredient in society, without which nations and communities could not exist in a state of civilization. It is the lot of men. It is a source of wealth, since without poverty, there could be no labor, there could be no riches, no refinement, no comfort, and no benefit to those who may be possessed of wealth." And so even though this sounds like a very anarchic kind of quote, but Chris Ryan brings us back to where we are right now. I mean, are we really that different? We are now forced to work for companies or in the market economy. We still have multinational corporations going out there, buying land in poor countries, forcing populations off the land, right? And they always ask the question, why do activists get so upset about this? And they presume that, we're doing you a service. And after they mine and harvest, whether it's fruit or minerals, then they offer wage slavery to the locals, right? That to then take that money, right? Now they earn a wage to then buy industrialized produced food at inflated prices from a company. When before all this happened, these people could have been living completely well and fine without that kind of intervention, right? And so it goes to the heart of it, which is this is the very twisted notion of progress that we have today. So to end off this part, right, he has this metaphor. Again, I like his metaphors. I think it really helps to enrich our imagination. It's like as if we've been forced to join a casino at gunpoint, and we stand to lose everything because we're going to accumulate debt from just getting an education, buying a house, right? And then when things go wrong, we're then told we got a gambling problem. And I find like that's such a great way of trying to communicate what's so wrong with the way things are done today. Okay, so anyway, back to you guys. So I have one starting question for you, which is, I find that as I'm reading through all these arguments, right, I'm wondering, is it more to do with capitalism than civilization? Because isn't this really more about the growth mindset, imperialism, which, I don't know, if we don't live in a capitalist economy, will we still try to conquer other lands? And is this really like the characteristics that I just mentioned, from the hierarchy to specialization of labor? Is this really something inherent to the agriculture revolution? Yeah.
Well, my current perspective is that a lot of these things are due to capitalism, but if you look at the roots of capitalism, they lie in colonialism. So it depends on how far back you want to go. What came to mind when you were talking about this section is there's this incredible short book that I read called Creating a World That Works for All, and it's written by this guy, Sharif Abdullah. And he breaks down the 3 stages of civilization or history that we have gone through. And he uses these 3 terms, keepers, breakers, and menders. And so keepers is what he uses to refer to indigenous cultures. They were people who lived on the land. They were grateful stewards of what they had, so they were the keepers. And then the breakers were like, the prime example would be like someone like Christopher Columbus. He was a breaker. He came and, he was extractive. He exploited people. And in many ways, we have been living with the legacy of the breaker mentality. So these are just mindsets, right? And at any one point, you can have these 3 mindsets coexisting. So you know, the reason why he has this third term called Menders is because like he feels we can't really go back to exactly what indigenous cultures were. I mean, you know, at this stage, I think it's impossible to just, I mean, it'd be foolish to think we could just reverse time and go back. And so what we are called upon to do is to become menders. We need to take what is around us. And I think, this fits completely with Christopher Ryan's argument. It's taking the best of what is from the past and also from the present and creating something that's more livable. So I kind of really like these three terms: keepers, breakers, and menders. And I think we should all be focusing on being menders at this point. But another thing I'll add is about all these kind of discussions over, where was the turning point where we went wrong, and looking at the archaeological evidence. It's always very hard for me to say for sure, like, is what I'm hearing, this story that is being told, is it the truth? Because so much of it depends on like the evidence that they uncover, right? And the evidence from the past is so slim that it's like you just uncover one new piece of information and it transforms the whole, transforms whole theories in anthropology and whatever. So I'm always just skeptical that, this story, that this consensus that agriculture was like kind of the big mistake that we made. While I largely think it's definitely worth thinking about, I don't know if like I would accept it as the absolute truth.
Okay, let me address that, Santosh, quickly before I go to you. Yeah, so there's this thing that Chris Ryan also he runs into in his interviews, for example. So, he would openly concede that, he's got criticism from other scholars and they would kind of accuse him of cherry picking evidence. And so he actually talks about, sure, but, it's really because as human beings, we come in with a certain perspective about what is the most important factors in social change, right, and history. And he doesn't deny it, but he doesn't deny the idea of cherry picking evidence, but what he's saying is that everyone does that. So that's one. Number two, the question to ask really is that, are the cherries representative of the tree? What kind of cherries are we talking? And you're right. I think for the three of us, at least, I don't really know about the two of you, but I'm clearly not an expert in archaeology and anthropology. I take that to mean that, look, at the end of the day, when we look at history, we only can identify grand movements, social movements, right? Things that have totally transformed societies in a very spiritual and materialistic level. So I think it's just that maybe with where we are right now, it does seem like agriculture is one of those easier to understand social phenomena. So that's one. And then two, Chris Ryan also makes this point, right? He's not saying that there's a certain like turning point where, wow, everything just changed overnight. It clearly evolved over, hundreds or maybe even thousands of years, right? But it's just that with every incremental change, right, over the years, these concepts evolve, and we went from being monarchs to feudal society, etc. So obviously there's so much change, but even with all this change, you can see this predominant spiritual pattern of like ownership, hierarchy, specialization of labor. And it's like you can't take that away from agriculture, I assume. I assume that's the way they pin it down. Okay, Santosh.
Yeah, if I were to just shine a magnifying glass in that transition from hunter-gatherers to agriculture, I think there are two things that came out and stood out for me. First is the concept of property, and secondly is the concept of ownership. Yeah, so I think like these are two things that we can do a deeper dive into, like when we have conversations with our children. So what is property and what is ownership? And just have conversations over and over again on property and ownership. I think those are two things that I take away from that magnifying glass that I'm shining in that transition period. And it's the whole idea that actually in the hunter-gatherers, the land was collectively owned by all of us. So we own it. And if, one person's mistake is our mistake, one person's benefit is our benefit. So there was this whole idea of collective ownership and the idea that there's no such thing as property, but when we transition into agriculture, you are given, and with feudalism, you're given this plot of land, you are, this is your property. And because women couldn't work on the lands as hard as the men, they were not as productive on the lands, they were relegated as the property of the men for production. Yeah, so I think the whole idea of property can be reimagined. Yeah, so that's something that came to my mind, right? Like, so what do I own really in this, like every moment when I'm mindfully present and when I'm meditating, I just want to ask myself, like, what do I own? And what do I possess? Do I possess this house really? Am I the rightful owner of all of this? Like, so this is something that I do as a practice to wean myself off the attachment to the idea that I own something, and actually I don't. Like, if you want to move towards a state of flow, which is what Unsu is talking about, right? State of flow, flowing through life, then you're in a whole idea of like, I don't owe anything. And there's this whole collective property that we are all a part of. So this is one thing that came to my mind. The second thing that came to my mind as you were talking, like, I don't know, it was just very nauseating. Like, wow, Douglas, like the words that you use, it was just crazy and very visceral. Like when I was in France, right, like they use these terms to describe like indigenous people, right? Les barbares, so like les barbares and
What does it mean?
the barbaric,
Oh,
like it's a very derogative, very demeaning term that they use on uncivilized nations. So the roots of colonial history and imperialism, they run deep in such in the European countries, though there is a shift. I mean, you have also a shift in parts of like France to eco villages and to something else that came to my mind is the 12 principles of permaculture, which I feel is a great tool to help us navigate the change moving forward. So we don't need to like take down this entire civilized state, but with the 12 principles of permaculture, we can just work with what we have currently and just move one step forward, and then the next step forward, and then the next step forward. So that's the 12 principles of permaculture in comparison to agriculture or industrialization. In the productivity narrative. So I think there are lots of like wisdom in the principles of permaculture that we can tap on just to move a step forward, and not and as what Ansu mentioned, right? To mend the civilization. I think that is what came to my mind.
Wow, there's actually quite a lot of things I want to address. I'm going to try to remember some of them, given my lack of sleep. Okay, so the one about property, right? Like this whole idea that we need to interrogate ourselves as to what the concept of property means to us, right? And look, it's more than just owning a house. Like I mentioned just now, there's the idea about having a wife, because Chris Ryan, like I said, he also talks about sexuality. And one of the things that he likes to point out is that, in this hunter-gatherer societies, women, literally, like people don't belong to one another. So two people may get married, but the village elder may tell the two of them, the couple, that yes, you may love each other now, but you may grow to love other people later on. And this is something that he talks about. Like there's this very libertarian spirit when it comes to love, marriage, partnership in these societies. And I think it's a very hard one for people of today to grapple with. I actually am very comfortable with it, just being very open about myself. I'm very libertarian when it comes to love. But, I get it. Like to a lot of people, that's very hard. It's hard to believe that, okay, the person I'm married to can be shared with another person, right? Or may love other persons as well, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing, important part about this is because Chris Ryan feels that by living in this kind of mindset, at least when it comes to sexuality, is the reason why we have major religions of today being incredibly oppressive and backward looking when it comes to sex, because they consider non-reproductive sex to be a sin, when non-reproductive, mutually enjoyable sex in all its varieties, right, it's a very defining human characteristic. So that's one thing about the property aspect. And Santosh, you're right? Like we need to ask ourselves, how many houses do we deserve to own? The idea is that, like, to me, I think surely we are entitled to own at least one property, right? A home that we can call our own. But do we deserve to own 2, 5, 10, 20 properties? And to by allowing such a mechanism in society, then hence exacerbate inequality and also wield power to property owners. So I think that's a question we need to dabble with. And there was something else that Unsu, about breakers and menders. So actually this will come about a bit later, but all I was going to say in regards to your framing, right, is that I think another task at hand is to basically, when it comes to breakers, we need to do something about these people. Yeah, I'm not saying do something criminal or violent. I'm just saying that we need to dethrone them, because just like how Christopher Columbus' legacy is being questioned, and there's obviously a lot of contention because Italian Americans may feel like as if their hero is being debased. But there is this very ugly aspect of his rule. And, we need to learn to live with that the rulers, the leaders that we respect and that we honor, maybe they don't deserve that kind of reputation at all. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I think I was wondering where you were going with, like we need to take down these breakers, because to some extent, I also feel we need to acknowledge our own complicity in the civilization we're creating. Like, we are the breakers as well, whenever we engage in acts of consumerism without thinking how it impacts other people. But yeah, I mean, as far as like taking down statues of Christopher Columbus and replacing them with, more Mender type, sort of inspirational figures, I would definitely agree with it, because I think, these are public expressions of a society's values. And if we as a society want to start moving towards a Mender type mentality, then yeah, I think we need to start expressing it publicly as symbols.
Agreed.
Yeah. I think in the stories that we're going to tell our children, it's going to be more Mender stories, so we can be even mindful of the stories that we plant in the minds of children or the next generation. That's something that came to my mind. Something else that is quite personal for me is spiritual mobility. So I used to go to church, and like, I don't know, it was just so difficult to get out of church because of in-group and out-group, right? And it's really tough, like, because the sense of belonging and love I had with these people was so strong. But yet there was some part of me that was against organized religion and the cult-like behavior of the environment. And so that's why my position has shifted, like, on spiritual mobility. So on spirituality or religion. Yeah, so I'm no longer like very close to in close affinity with like organized religions or organized groups for that matter, because that's where you have concentration of power and then potential for abuse, for example. Yeah, and I think I'm more of a I cultivate this whole idea of spiritual mobility at this phase of my life. And like, just recounting the moments when I was in church, like when you feel like you like someone of the opposite sex, but you just feel so shameful because you're viewing that as shame. And then you go down this downward spiral of, oh, I shouldn't honor this feeling and this emotion of affection I have for someone else. I should keep it within me. And so that's where I started being more repressed and suppressed. Yeah, so there are all these other aspects to like religion that I'm unpacking right now at this phase of my life. After I left, and fish doesn't know it's swimming in water, right? So I was swimming in the water and I didn't realize the existence of the water. It's so inconspicuous. Yeah, and so this is a whole journey of like self-awareness and realization. And we grow with day after day. We learn something new about ourselves and about the culture and environment that we are immersed in, and we're so oblivious to.
Okay, I want to say congratulations. I may be the only one in the world who will tell you that on doing what you're doing, living organized religion. But anyway, yeah. Look, that's nice to hear, Santosh, and I I think this is really hard to tackle, right? The whole notion of living in a cult or being in a cult. I'm actually incidentally reading a book about that right now. And I actually want to hear your story one day, so let me hold you to that and maybe talk about it sometime later in the future. Yeah. And thanks for sharing. That's very intimate of a story. Okay, I just want to press ahead because I think now we can get to some really meaty stuff. Okay, so like I mentioned in my introduction, I guess, which is, if I can remember correctly, it says, so we are now past maybe the first half of the book, and now it's just sort of the second half. And there's quite a number of essays that he writes, because these essays are kind of reflections on being human in a modern society. And he tackles various topics. So there can be like the loss of communal parenting, the idea that we raise children without play, the suppression of sexual expression among teenagers. So there are actually quite a lot of topics, but I'm just really going to tackle two. And the first one is the bulk of it, which is the chapter that he writes on anxious adults. Now, before I start talking about the details of this, right, there's a very good, again, metaphor analogy here. And it comes to, it actually pertains to grasshoppers and locusts. So he actually says, and he's quoting from a science essay here, that grasshoppers are actually like elegant, modest, well-mannered by insect standards. But locusts are considered trouble because they scurry about, they are, like a pest because they gather in swarms and they chew and feed on, farms, right? So they display very different behaviors, but they are essentially the same species. So he says, same DNA, but different critter. And the important thing here is that not all species of grasshoppers become locusts, but all locusts were once grasshoppers. And why is that? Because of the transformation of environment. And so, he talks about very familiar sounding variables, surplus food, rapid population growth, food supply starts to dwindle, areas that are now fertile become overcrowded, results in, higher population density, and these grasshoppers evolve to become locusts. And so obviously he's drawing a very strong comparison here with these insects and us as human beings, and whether we can identify that we are actually kind of having an epigenetic process here of change, like we are the same DNA as our ancestors, but it's our behaviors changing very remarkably because of our social conditions. So along with this story, another one that I really loved that he brought out was this documentary filmmaker who brought a couple of Papua New Guinea tribal members to the UK. And, he was actually very worried, this documentary filmmaker, that, by bringing them to the UK, might pollute their minds, make them very envious, but he had a huge shock, right? Because in the end, they come over to UK and they're very confused with, the way we function. In their world, they only spend 20 hours per week on work, which is collecting food and hunting. And they spend the rest of their time with their families. And they ask us, modern men, why are you spending so much time working in the office and not spending time with the people that you care about, And then when they ask, how much time do you need to pay for your house or to own a house? And the filmmaker says, like 25 to 35 years, right? Because you got to pay mortgage for that long. They're like, totally bewildered because they're like, just get a couple of friends, build a house in a couple of weeks. So, just comparing them and us, right? So here are some takeaways, right? When it comes to their lifestyle habits, they rarely work more than 3 to 4 hours a day. Their activities actually every day is filled with a lot of rituals, socialization, artistic expression. And the reason also is because they're very limited ones, but they have unlimited means, right, to obtain the things that they need. And so it boils down to this very philosophical conundrum for us, right, which is, in our society, we have a certain disdain for unproductive people, right? Because the idea is that you should be trying to work hard, But if you look at these societies, right, if work is, actually unnecessary, or it's in some sense almost quite fun, then why do you have to be so disdainful to unproductive people, or why do you hold people who work so hard in high regard in our societies? So the important other dimension here, which actually, Santosh, I think you kind of mentioned it a little bit just now, or is it Unsu, which is, it's not prosperity that's the key to life satisfaction. Chris Ryan cites the Italian economist Paulo Verme, who found the variable freedom and control to be the most significant predictor of quality of life that leads to happiness. And to Chris Ryan, as he puts it, it's the freedom not to get up 5 days a week, not obliged to shave, put on a tie, and pretend to respect or like someone who's just happens to be your boss, and just because you have to pay the bills, right? So that's the first part. Then the second part also to this is that, given this kind of disparity, this kind of difference, right? I mean, what happens also in our society is that we obviously have increasing wealth disparity. And what Chris Wright talks about is that due to this wealth disparity, it also leads to very abstract relationships that we have with people. And he actually thinks that the Joseph Stalin quote, "One death is a strategy, a million is a statistic," is very good exemplifier of the idea that, because we don't longer live in intimate relations with such people, so we don't actually have a emotional connection or relationship to our members of the community. And he even talks about how a politician, maybe a politician will have no trouble jumping into a river to save a drowning child, but he also have no qualms approving policies that would leave millions of impoverished kids without basic healthcare and lunches, because we now live in a grasshopper versus locust kind of world. The other thing that he also talks about is that we have now been bought into this idea about economic men, right? Something we talk about in previous episodes, this idea about Darwinian survival of the fittest. But this is really a fiction. Even Charles Darwin himself didn't believe that pre-state societies function well with material inequality. And so this is actually not something that you actually see with hunter-gatherers. So there's a very poignant quote here, so I'm going to just read it out in regards to how primitive men saw wealth and poverty. So the world's most primitive people have few possessions, but they're not poor. Poverty is not a certain small amount of goods, nor is it a relation between means and ends. Above all, it is a relation between people. Poverty is a social status. It is the invention of civilization. And the idea here is that, by the way, this quote I should mention, it comes from this guy. It's not Chris Ryan, it's Marshall Sahlins, who wrote this book called The Origin of Affluent Society. So the idea here is that if you take from this perspective, right, you don't have to feel like as if you need a lot of money to feel rich, right? Rich can be defined by how much stuff you don't need, actually. Yeah. Then actually further on, Chris Ryan then talks about how, and I like this part of the book, which is very internal and something we need to ask ourselves. Because he says that, he has met obviously very rich people, and what he answers to is that when people say that, okay, it's all about your values, it doesn't matter even if you become rich, it's more important that you're a good-hearted, kind person. He actually disagrees with that. He says, once you have $1 million, everything about you changes, because your taste will change, your perception and preference of being in the world will change. And he uses this example of he's very contented with just having $10, $20 wine. But once you start going to $40 or $400, your expectations change, because you forget about the context of the experience, which is just enjoying some fine wine, well, not fine wine, some nice wine among friends. And I love this quote. He says, "A watch tells us the time. A $20,000 Rolex tells people you've got issues." Yeah. So the other important thing about this is something that actually I think you and I have talked about so before, which is this idea about the hedonistic adaptation. So because people are very surprised that once they get used to something new, that new becomes old, and they start to crave and seek for more novel, more rich, as in materially richer experiences.
Yeah, I think it's called the hedonic treadmill.
Yeah, the hedonic treadmill. Yeah, that's right. And okay, I'm just going to just move on a little bit quickly. So again, another part of the book that I like, and I hope for those viewers out there, you're not going to like this term, but I'm going to say it. So he comes up with this complex called the rich asshole syndrome. And he uses that to describe people who, he gives an example of a Silicon Valley millionaire that he knows. And he was working, 12 hours a day, 10 hours on weekends. And he's already a millionaire, but he kind of says a few million just doesn't go as far as it used to. And being in a community of other millionaires, you feel like even at $10 million, it's not enough, and you got to do more than that. And so what happens, Chris Wright describes, is that there comes increasing insulation, because you're more and more distance away from society. You buy a car, you move in a very nice condo, you stay in expensive hotels, you just literally stop hanging out with real people. Yeah. There's another poignant story he gives, but I'll save that for later if it comes up. But in any case, the takeaway here is that it's this wealth differentials, right? So to him, and he comes up with a lot of good social science research as well in the book, that it's this wealth differentials that actually breaks the flow of human kindness and flow. Yeah. And so to him, it's the idea that when people become more insulated, right? That's where they also lose empathy. Yeah. And he exemplifies this with other pieces of social research, like wealthier people being more likely to cut in front of other drivers, more likely to cheat, more likely to lie, more likely to steal candy from babies even. And the reasons for all that is because they worry less about legal repercussions. Yeah. So anyway, the important point he makes, right, is that he's not saying that heartless people are more likely to become rich. He's saying that when you become rich, it corrodes whatever heart you got left. Yeah. And he even cites a study where it was the wealthy subjects in this study who became less unsettled by pictures of kids with cancer. And he relates that to a personal story, which, like I said, it's something that I can talk about later. So long and short of it is that, inequality itself, it seems to trigger a chemical reaction in the privileged. It causes them to be less likely to care about other people than themselves. And he also talks about this very proverbial business tip, right? Like businessmen like to say that, to become rich, you have to learn to say no, because you don't get approached by a lot of people, to fund or to spend or whatever, right? But the idea is that, to Chris Wright, is that when you have to refuse sincere requests for help, it's not natural to our species. We actually derive deep satisfaction from helping others, and it's just due to the deep architecture of the brain. And along with that, he also talks about how it's actually collaborated with our studies on evolutionary cousins like chimpanzees and bonobos. Yeah, that cooperation is very kind of default. Yeah. Okay, so that sums up on the wealth and inequality part. Then the other part, just a quick one, is about death, because Chris Wright also sometimes talk about how, I think in the midst of writing this book, his dad passed away and he had to look after his, aging dad. And he had this experience of like recognizing that it's so hard to die well, because you're constantly probed and told to go for expensive and painful procedures, and doctors or the medical community tries to have unrealistic expectations of prolonging life. And he actually even cited like how these end of life experiences, like the people who experience end of life care, they've reported increased levels of pain from 1998 compared to 2010. And even the popular author Atud Gawande, the one who wrote the book Being Mortal, he's a doctor. Like even he also talks about in his book like how doctors may be unintentionally inflicting cruelty in medicine because they're just not recognizing the priorities of the sick and the aged, and that they deserve to have more dignified care, and compassion when it comes to the end of life. Now here's the sad part though, right? Going back to forager or hunter-gatherer societies, Jared Diamond actually talks about how they treat the old, right, and the terminally ill. Is they tend to ignore them. They may even encourage them to take their life by going out to sea or jumping from a cliff, or assisted suicide, sometimes even done without consent or knowledge. So it does seem very barbaric for sure, but Chris Ryan probes the question, are we really doing any better when we send our terminally ill to aged care hospitals where, and I've been to one before, and it can actually be really desolate and very ugly to see as well. So anyway, the point is, having said all that, like I said, these are all reflections of using the civilized to death points and looking at our own society. So I want to ask you guys, right? So how do you think we can, promote this culture of frugality and simplicity when it does seem like anyway, wealth and greed, it does provide its own dopamine, something that I should have talked about, and its own incentives. Yeah, and going back to what Unsu you mentioned just now about breakers, like I said, how do we reject the narrative that millionaires and billionaires is something that Chris Ryan talks about? How can we stop recognizing them as heroes and promote the message that inequality itself is a problem?
Yeah, I don't think there are any silver bullets or, slam dunk answers. I mean, I think in some ways that's why we started the show, Breaking the Spell. I mean, this is a very strong and powerful spell, and I think we are in a process of exploring like how we can start picking it apart. I think like one of the keys is like there's this writer that I've been reading. Her name is Genevieve Vaughn, and she writes books like The Paternal Roots of the Gift Economy, and she thinks of the human species as not Homo sapiens, but Homo donans, we who give. She actually thinks that the root of our nature is to give, to help. And, like as an example, she says, all of us are born as babies. And as the human child of any species is the most vulnerable and dependent, we spend years and years of our lives completely dependent on someone else for our existence. So much so that this child psychologist Winnicott said, we shouldn't even have the noun baby because a baby on its own can't survive. It is non-existent. And so our first experience of life is that we are just receiving. It's a unilateral gift. The mother, gives us life and nurtures us without expecting anything in return. And at some point in our education, we turn 4 years old, 5 years old, even maybe when we start learning language, we start being indoctrinated into this other way of thinking that central to us is exchange. And this eventually becomes like the markets of capitalism, that we need to give something to get something in return. And this mindset of exchange comes to eclipse our first insight of life, that life is a gift. And so I think one of the keys would be to just constantly remind each other that the exchange, this aspect of exchange and markets and needing to deserve something before you get it, that this is an artificial layer that has been imposed on us on the real foundation of our existence, which is like that we as a species have always been giving and receiving. So yeah, I mean, no clear answers, but I think it's just this constant reminder.
I really love what Ansu mentioned about giving, and giving is not zero sum. Actually, it's positive sum. So like the amount you give multiplies and it circulates back to us because experientially we feel it. We feel we receive so much when we give. It's so innate and it's so experiential in that we can validate it from our own experience. So that's one thing about the gift economy that really struck me when Ansu talked about it.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about gift in contrast to exchange is, a gift sets up an ongoing relationship. When I give you something, we now have a relationship because at some point you might return me a favor in the future. And exchange cancels the relationship. I give something to you, you give me money, we walk away.
Off we go.
There's no promise, no need to continue that relationship. So, the gift mindset nurtures relationships.
Something else that I think Ansu brought up, which was deservedness. Deservedness, yeah. Like I feel like, I don't know, there is a block within me with regards to deserving, being deserving of receiving a gift from someone. Like I feel like I have so many blockages. I'm working with someone on like an energetic practice of receiving, which I've got a lot of difficulties with. So receiving can not just be in the form of a material good or money, but it can also be in the form of praise and appreciation. And if I trace back my own experience from before the school system to during the school system and after the school system, I was very different as a child before the school system. And I don't think there were any qualms with regards to receiving. There was a lot more flow with regards to receiving. But I don't know, now as an adult, it's very strange to receive praise or appreciation or even money, because you feel like then what is like, what do I have to give back? Or yeah, so I think there's this whole idea of unlearning and unconditioning that we all need to go through. Yeah, this is how I think, yeah, if you can explore the idea of like deservedness, it's quite a strong word, and I don't know, it just rang quite deeply within my own psyche. Like, yeah, do I deserve this life? Do I, yeah, it's a gift of life, but do I deserve it? Yeah, so embracing it, yeah, embodying it, those are some things that came to my mind. Now, with regards to what Douglas, you mentioned, right, in terms of economic and social policy, so economic policy, wealth taxes, universal basic income, minimum wage, those are like maybe three things. A shift to cooperatives, worker-owned cooperatives, instead of the whole idea of a group of owners owning the factors of production, which includes labor as well as the capital. Yeah, so I think a shift towards like worker-owned cooperatives. So these are like maybe some aspects of social policy that we can or where we have levers to shift. With regards to economic, with regards to social policy, generous maternal and paternity leave for parents. I think that's one thing that Christopher Ryan talked about. So those are some things that came to my mind. I think which are levers that we can pull. Just recently, the Nobel Prize in Economics for 2021 awarded to David Card and Joshua Angrist and Guido Imbens. What they proved, they found that a modest increase in the minimum wage did not kill jobs. You know, there's this narrative, if we remember a particular member of parliament who refuted the claims, who refuted the calls for minimum wage by saying that we will have no more jobs. Yeah, so this is a study that's showing that it did not kill jobs. This is a bombshell for the economic world that is challenging an orthodoxy that has dominated the field for decades. Yeah, so I think there's significant breakthroughs even in the field of economics that's going to shift the way we're looking at like minimum wage or universal basic income. Yeah, or an economy that's more redistributive, that's more conscious and regenerative. Yeah. So those were some things that came to my mind. Yeah.
Yeah, glad that you brought those up. Yeah, so I don't have to talk about it myself. So great. Thanks for bringing that up, Santosh. Along with that, I would just add, like, there's this parable that Chris Ryan shares, because you talk about deservedness, right? So he says, like, there's this, and this didn't come from the book. I saw this from an interview he had. He talks about how there's this particular hunter-gatherer society, and I don't think it's like really back in the past. I think it's something that still exists either in right now or at least in recent history. So he says, like, this group of this tribe, right, has this particular cultural practice where they make the arrows, they go out to hunt, and what happens is that when they bring back the returns, right, the returns from the hunt, right, is shared equally. Now, here's a very important thing that he mentions: there can be this person who created the arrow that killed the animal, right? Hence, in our language, he will be considered the most responsible person, right? And supposedly to deserve the best bits, right, of the hunt. But in this society, they don't allow that, or at least this person doesn't have that kind of tendency to want to claim, like the best returns. Yeah, because he actually recognizes that if he were to try anything, like to be selfish or to hoard, right, he actually risks what Ryan calls reputational damage, and people actually pretty much shun that kind of behavior. Like, even though, yes, you created the arrow, but maybe when the tribe went on the hunt, that guy could have been sleeping, he could have been like doing something else. And the idea is that, yeah, all he did was just create the arrow, but it doesn't mean that he deserves, the best bits of the hunt. Yeah. So,
Actually,
so that's
speaking of that, he had an anecdote that an African villager told his wife that the best place to store my extra food is in my friend's stomach. And
yes, that's right.
I mean, it's just perfect because, like, yeah, this African villager knew that, if he has extra food and he gives it to his friend, I mean, yeah, in future when his friend has extra food, he will be in the receiving end, right? So, Yeah, but I love that saying. Like the best place to store my extra food is in my friend's stomach.
Wow. Don't hoard it. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and then I guess moving away from the book, but to talk about you, Santosh, and the concept of deservedness. Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. Of course, you deserve to live. Of course, you deserve what you have right now. Assuming you're not some rich bastard that's hiding lots of millions of money in some offshore bank account. But yeah, but no, but I mean, let me put it this way. I mean, just speaking on a personal note, like I myself try to, I think I mentioned it in our coffee chat, coffee break session that I try my best to treat my friends, especially those that are economically more disadvantaged. And I don't ever expect anything from them. And I think there is this, mutual recognition. Like of course, sometimes they want to do likewise for me. They want to treat me to a cup of coffee or something like that. But I always try to, go out my way. Like let's say we're in the food court, and I'll say, "Oh, let me pay for this." Then they'll be like, "Oh no, it's okay. Let me do it this time." And then I'll say, "Okay, let me do it next time." So I feel in the end, it just needs to come about in a very genuine way that that people are not expecting anything from you. If tomorrow you and I go out and have a meal, right? Like I'm going out to have a meal with you, and if I want to treat you, I'll treat you. And I will not even whisper a word of saying, "Oh well, now you got to, take me out for a movie or something like that," right? Like I'll just let it be. Like I've done what I've done, and I meant it as a friend and as a fellow human being. And I think that is something that we can at least manage in our personal relationships, but it's definitely very hard to scale. And I think that's why that's why I brought up those questions, because it's something that Chris Ryan also contends with. He does acknowledge that it's very hard to scale this kind of relationships, the reciprocal relationship or the give economy. But we have to make we have to craft our way towards it, right? Because this is a lot more meaningful, and I think people would definitely benefit, as you both have mentioned, from having that as the basic fundamental norm of society versus this exchange-based and profit-based driven ethos. Yeah. Okay, I'm pretty much near the end. So shall I just kind of wrap up and then we have our final discussion?
Sure.
Yeah. So basically, it's just that at the end of the book, he basically paints this crossway junction, and he basically says there's basically three ways to go. And look, Chris Ryan is that kind of guy that doesn't like to give specific advice. He likes to, as we have done, painted very comprehensively as much as we can within the time that we have, a very detailed picture of human nature, human society, etc. And so, in the end, it's up to us as to what we want to do. So the first one that he talks about is denial and anger, right? Which is we can just continue to allow incompetence, indecency, greed to just run rampant and go beyond the points or go beyond the tipping points, right? Beyond repair, where we are literally entering the sixth extinction, right? The second one he calls bargaining and depression. So it's kind of like metaphorically, we continue doing what we're doing. We keep coming up with temporary fixes, trying to ignore long-term trends and any issues. We try to upgrade using technology. But at the end of the day, we haven't resolved the fundamental malice that we're in. And the third one, obviously, is the one that he's begging us to do, is to move into this stage of acceptance, right? Which is to bring hunter-gathering thinking into our modern lives. Very specifically, he talks about things like replacing top-down structures with peer progressive networks, horizontal collectives, providing basic income. Something that he also talks about is just providing basic income and education, especially for women, because in that very indirect way, it can lead to population decline. He just thinks that we have just way too many people, and that's why we have these problems, because we're trying to feed everyone. Yeah, and he talks about the idea, like you can see that on a philosophical level, as compared to maybe some of the other books that we have read, right? Sometimes they discuss or point to the Enlightenment project as an issue, like it's a fundamentally misguided project. But he doesn't try to see it that way. He kind of talks about how we are still riding on the tailcoats of Enlightenment, and we can make it better, basically, if we know how to make good progress with where we have come, but also celebrate the past and integrate that, in a nice web, right? So, like I said, going back to what I mentioned just now, it's basically about designing a better zoo, because we're going to live in this zoo. How can we just make it better for all of us? So, to come to a close, so let's just talk a little bit. I just want to ask you guys, like, on a personal level, do you see any of these things, affecting or anything you want to bring about into your life as change, to live in that kind of manner, a little bit more hunter-gatherer like? Yeah.
Santosh, you go first.
Yeah, if there's one thing, it's my mindset with regards to like we need to go back to the past. This whole mindset, like we need to bring back the ancient and indigenous wisdom, like, or we need to move forward in progress, right? I think I'm changing my positions in all of that. I like to take a different position now. It's the idea of progressive revelation. Now, what I mean by progressive revelation is just to allow the universe to unfold and to whisper its secrets to all of us, and to just be a vessel for doing good in society, and allowing the human civilization to unfold as the story unfolds, and to be co-creators in that story. Yeah, so not to go back, not to bring back things from the past, but just to bit by bit allow things to unfold and to unwrap as the story continues, and as we rewrite the histories of the past with new information that we discover as we move in the future. So I'm moving to a stage of like maybe more passive acceptance, from the past, where I used to be an activist who was very actively wanting to change things. But I've shifted my positions to just allowing things to unfold as they are, and to just suspend all judgment, and to be in the mystery and awe of what's unfolding in the moment. So that's one practice that has brought about tremendous amount of peace. And with that, I save water, I consume less, I have connections with other people, and all of that just transforms the world for me. Yeah. So that's one thing. The second realization I had is I'm no longer going to go for movies. Like, movies are just boring. Like, conversations like this, which are a movie in itself, they're just amazing, and I feel so enriched. Yeah, because this is like a movie that we're co-creating, and a narrative that we're co-creating, and that's so beautiful. That's one thing that came to my mind as well. Yeah, so those were like two things.
You have to watch Dune.
You have to watch
Dune. It's an movie. It's very spiritual.
I'll try. Yeah, there was something else that I think Unsu had once narrated to me. It was a story of his personal life experience at the Burning Man festival, towards the end of which he shares a lot of spiritual elements too, like how, just by giving, things just flow naturally. Your needs are met as you meet the needs of others very naturally. But he talked about a tribe he met, and that tribe, as they move from one place to another, they'll burn and they'll dispose of all their possessions, and they'll start life afresh. Yeah, so that was a poignant tale that stuck to my mind. And yeah, I don't know if Ansu, you'd like to talk a bit more about that, or you can just conclude with your own parting words. But yeah, those were some things that came to my mind.
Yeah, no, I'll talk about something else. I just wanted to read a quote from the book. I think the one that really stood out for me, that's just very poetic. So he writes, "In the course of a normal day, we take innumerable forgotten steps through unremarkable doorways. Only in retrospect does it sometimes become clear that one of those unremembered gates was in fact a point of no return." And I really love that, because it's like, I think we are kind of sleepwalking through life, through civilization. And I really appreciate writers like Christopher Ryan, who make the effort to try and help us remember those unremembered gates we walk through. Because at the time, we don't know the consequences, so we don't forget it. We don't remember it. We don't store it in our memory. But as insignificant as they were at that point, like, they have incredible consequences for us. And so I actually put Christopher Ryan in this very wonderful list of people who are helping us remember. So, like, people like Ronald, Wright. He talks a lot about Rick Doblin, this researcher in psychedelics. And I actually met Rick Doblin at Burning Man. He came to our camp, and it was like having a personal TED talk. And I really respect the efforts. I mean, he has single-handedly managed to put psychedelics and other important drugs that have been demonized back into therapeutic use that have incredible potential to heal addiction and PTSD and other things. I'll mention another writer, Mark Boyle. I read his book at the beginning of last year. He wrote a book called The Way Home. He's an English writer, and I think he and Christopher Ryan would be good friends, because Mark Boyle, he does these experiments on himself. Like one year, he tried to get through a year without any money, just kind of being on the streets, begging, asking, getting money from people. And then another year, he decided to just go off into the woods and cut himself off from civilization. He's a writer. He normally writes on a laptop. So he said, okay, no technology. I'm just going to write in a book. I'm going to give up my car. I'm just going to ride a bicycle. And what I love about, people like him and Douglas, as you pointed out, like even Christopher Ryan, like he walks the talk. He's not just talking about theories. He's trying to actually live this life. And so I really appreciate their example, because even though it may seem out of reach for me personally, but to know that there are people who, Mark Ball, at the end of the year, he said, I was happier. And when I started typing on a computer, it felt weird. I didn't like it. I went back to my notebook. So the fact that he actually said that he was happier for that gives me hope, right? Even though I'm not quite there yet. And Christopher Ryan, very early on, he had told a story of a man who, because of some event, decided to just start walking backwards, because he felt that walking backwards would, I can't remember, bring world peace or something, right? But he used this story to illustrate that, even though he was walking backwards, we can all agree that our body was not designed for that. But I would actually use that story metaphorically, that, people like Christopher Ryan and Mark Boyle, they are demonstrating to us how you can walk backwards, which seems very unnatural, to give up technology, to give up all these things. And so what I'm trying to do is do small experiments in walking backwards. But it's like for every step backwards I take, I'm walking 9 steps forwards. And it seems difficult, but if each year, I can just increase the number of steps I walk backwards. I don't know. That's just my personal goal.
Do you mean that literally or metaphorically, walking
Metaphorically.
I was like thinking, whoa, that's quite an experiment.
But I think that Santosh's suggestion that we do a breaking the spell where we're outside walking and talking, I think we should do that backwards.
Let's do that.
Yeah. Unsu, just both of you, thanks so much for bringing up the stuff that you've personally taken away from our discussion or from the book. I just want to hit on a few points, especially Unsu, you brought the idea about sleepwalking, because I mentioned just now there's a very personal story that Chris Ryan shares in the book, and it's again to do with the wealth thing, because he said that he went on a holiday, in India actually, and he was confronted with starving children, people who were begging on the streets. And he asked himself, and he talks about this in the book, that he realized that if he gave up an expensive meal, he could probably give this child maybe a year's education. And if he maybe look at his budget, his travel budget, maybe he could build a school, So he really questioned himself, and he asked himself, right, why am I, he wants to give money, obviously, he wants to help, but he also asked himself, why does it seem so hard, right? And that's where it goes back to what Unsu, you talk about sleepwalking. That's where he realized that due to wealth differentials, you sleepwalk. You literally don't see people around you, and you don't realize the privilege that you have, or that there's so much good that you can do in the world. And he's not like an activist or charity giver or anything like that, or philanthropist, but you can tell with the words that he writes and the messages that he's giving, he is advocating for such a change in the world. So that's one thing. And the other thing that you mentioned was, oh man, I'm running out of thought. Okay, basically, let me say this for myself, right? Yeah, so I take all those messages that I just mentioned to heart, say egalitarianism, right? I do think that it's not just about me being an egalitarian. Society needs to be egalitarian. So there needs to be some effort put towards that. Being very minimal with my living, I think that, and I want to cover this in future episodes, this idea about consumption and materialism, for me, as it is with tribal societies, I mean, if you really look at them, there are very few possessions, and I also try to live my life through that. I don't deny I need a computer, maybe I need a video console, but I'm inspired by, let's say, a friend of mine who travels from Hong Kong to other places, and like me, he's still a bit of a technophile. Like he still uses some modern tech, but he keeps it very minimal, and he's able to travel very easily between countries. And it's something that I tell myself that I should try to strive for. And yeah, and about mobility, you know, like what you say, Unsu, now I remember. We may be really hard pressed and constrained to be able to make a lot of options in terms of mobility right now, but I do I do think about maybe the idea one day, you know, when I get old and I'm going to retire or whatever, like I really want to revert back to a much more simplistic lifestyle. And I don't have the option right now, but you know, I believe that, you know, I should work towards it. And as it stands, at least with the way I lead my life, I just try to incorporate these values as much as possible. And that includes also other stuff that we didn't talk about, like the idea about evolving play in your life. That's something that actually Chris Ryan talks about. Now I remember, also you mentioned psychedelics. So this is actually a very important part of the book. We don't have time to cover it right now, and I do think it's a bit hard to get into considering we live in Singapore. So much legalities and nuances about this topic, and I'm not personally, you know, someone who plans to use that. But I accept the idea of it being a norm, and I think that we need to decriminalize and not look at these things in such a negative manner. They do clearly have a very integral part to play in human psychology and treatment of mental illnesses. So yeah, so with that, any last words before we come to a close? No? Okay, so thanks so much. And again, just to mention, right, I wanted to mention this earlier. Like I said, I don't think Chris Ryan is a very popular author to maybe most of our viewers out there. So you may even find it very hard to find a book at, say, commercial bookstores. So you can actually try to find this book at the Singapore Library of all places. So that's where I found this copy. I have an electronic copy as well. That's how I started reading the book. So if you want to, you know, I hope our conversation would pique your interest and you give the book a shot. And, you know, if you do, please come back with comments. We'd love to hear from you. All right. And with that, thanks everybody, and see you another day.
All right. Thanks, Douglas, for introducing the book. It was great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Yeah.